Portrait mode? Really? Portrait mode?
Hello and welcome to another episode of Locals Learn. This week it's a pretty interesting episode. There's a lot of myself learning along with you guys, as this is something that I had never really attempted before now. This week we're going to be looking at field recording or found sound recording. This is something I've messed with just a little bit before and never very deeply. So this past weekend I took a road trip out to eastern Oregon, went to Malheur Wildlife Refuge, as well as many areas in that vicinity. And what I did is I took my field recorder with me, and I decided to try to record some lovely wildlife sounds, the best I could. And it was quite an adventure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get into what I was expecting it would be like, what it was actually like, as well as what I learned, and give you guys a bit of a demo, a sample of some sounds that I recorded. So without further ado, let's get into it. This is the field recorder that I chose to take with me because it's the one that I own. It's the Zoom H4n Pro. I've been really happy with its results when recording in a more studio-like setting, recording a drum set or percussion or anything that I need an area recorder for. But I've never really tried it out in a nature setting. So I know that it's very sensitive to wind, so I made sure to bring the windscreen along with me. This is what it looks like without it. But aside from that, I really didn't know what to expect. I was kind of freestyling it. So when I got out there, I was very glad that I brought the wind shield along. It was exceptionally windy, and you'll hear in many of the recordings that the wind came through anyway. But I dread to think what it would have been like without the wind shield. When I was out there recording, there were a lot of bird and plant sounds that I really wanted to try to capture. Lots of plants rustling in the wind, lots of birds I'm hearing in far off trees, but I found it was really difficult to capture those sounds. Part of that was down to just the amount of wind that was present, and that's something that I'm sure would have perhaps been remedied if I had a few more days out there to come back and try different areas and different weather conditions, but I only had the one day, so I had to try to make do with that. The other thing that I found very tricky is that when you crank up the sensitivity on these, it's not just like listening very closely to something. Your brain, you can listen very closely to something and try to pick out what that sound is. So if you hear a bird, you can try to listen for that bird and listen to it a little bit more closely. But really with these, you just end up getting more ambient noise. And part of that is because this is a 90-degree field recorder, so it's going to be getting everything in a 90-degree angle in front of it, as opposed to something more focused like a shotgun mic that would be very directional, very focused at whatever you're trying to capture. But I found this just picking up a ton of ambient noise, so it was very tricky to try to single in on a single sound source and try to capture that clearly, because as you turned up the sensitivity more, you just get more and more ambient noise, and in this case that was usually just wind. And part of that was very disheartening because I didn't end up bringing any headphones with me to preview my files while I was out recording them. That's definitely something I would do differently the next time I go out to try to do this, is to plug in some headphones, take a listen either in real time or at a recorded file to try to see how it's coming in. What can I change right now to help mitigate some of the problematic things that I'm recording? So as I was recording more and more things with this, I started discovering a couple things that you can try to do. With regards to wind, I ended up getting closer to the ground. as I got closer and closer to the ground, the wind got weaker and weaker. So many of the recordings that I took with this thing, I ended up crouching down near to the ground and pointing up at the source that I was trying to capture. That helped minimize the amount of wind noise I was getting on most of my later recordings. The other thing that I learned about this thing is that it's very sensitive to any kind of noise happening on the body of it, whether that is the rustling of the buttons, the creaking of the battery compartment. All these things end up very loud on the recorded file, so I had to try to place my hands very carefully sometimes while I was recording something quite faint, so that these noises wouldn't come through on the recorded file. So, to sum up the things that I learned from this experience, I would say number one is to expect a lot of wind, especially if you're obviously going out to the desert like I was, but wind is really just the killer when it comes to audio recordings, just due to how sensitive microphones are to it. You can do a lot of things to help mitigate that by bringing wind screens, or by getting closer to the ground so that there's less wind happening down there. But ultimately, it's just gonna happen, and trying to time your recordings carefully to help get in the weak spots of wind, that can help as well. But really, you just have to expect it and try to work around it. The second thing that I learned is definitely to be as stationary as you possibly can so that you're not jostling any of the buttons and making any extra noise on the unit itself. In the future, what I might even do is attach it to a tripod and place the tripod where I want to point the recorder at, start recording and let it sit, just step away, so that I'm not creating any extra noise by trying to move it, tilt it, or somehow change its position or brush up against it so that it's catching all that noise. I think I would much rather just set it, leave it, and maybe try multiple different angles one at a time to try to get different options in my final product. I think the top thing that I learned from this, though, is definitely to have patience. I was only out in the eastern part of the state for one day, and I only had enough time to go to one or two locations to get some good recordings off. And unfortunately, I think that really hindered what I was able to get out of it. It feels a lot like wildlife photography to me. A good friend of mine who's a photographer always tells me that sometimes you can go out to the perfect location with the perfect subjects, and you can take what you think are some great shots, but you get back and you're looking at them, and just none of them are really doing anything for you. But sometimes you can go out to the same location the next day and you get fantastic shots, even though you changed fundamentally nothing about your approach. And I think that is really just how sound recording, field recording, works as well, at least from my experience of it. You really need to go into it trying your best and also being patient if trying your best isn't enough that day, if you're just not getting good stuff from your session. So, the three things I learned. Bring tools that are right for the job, things like a wind screen if it's going to be especially windy. Don't move while you're recording, even if it's just trying to get a different angle. Finish on the angle you're on, stop your recording, reposition, and then restart, just to make sure that you're not making a ton of extra noise on the unit or around where you are. And the third thing, just keep trying. Have some patience. Go out to different areas. Go out to the same area the next day. See what changed. And just keep trying, and eventually you will get some really stellar sounds. So, without further ado, take a listen to what I got. This is a bit of a compilation, about a minute and a half, of some of my favorite recordings that I got while out in the field. And I hope that we'll see you next time.